reviewing the September 2019 Watchtower Study Edition for the week of November 25th through December 1st. This is the JW Review. Hello everyone, welcome to the JW Review. My name is Mike Felker, and this is the weekly podcast where we go over next week's Watchtower study article and we compare it to what the scriptures teach. I am not a Jehovah's Witness, I am not an ex-Jehovah's Witness, I am just a Christian who believes what the Bible teaches, and I like to look at what the Watchtower says and just compare it to the Bible. And I say these things because we have a lot of new listeners regularly who are coming in. So thank you so much. If you are new, if you're watching or listening to this for the first time, I am really glad you're here. I know there's still a lot of those of you who are still attending meetings weekly. And that's where you find these reviews to be really helpful because you're getting to discuss these articles with your loved ones who are still believing everything the Watchtower teaches, but perhaps you're a little more skeptical of the Watchtower, so you like to look at these things with a little more of a critical eye, and you're finding these reviews to be helpful. So thank you so much, everyone who lets me know about those things. That's really encouraging. It means a lot to know, why you're watching or listening to this. And I know there's also some Jehovah's Witnesses who are faithful Jehovah's Witnesses who still believe what the Watchtower teaches and will defend the Watchtower. I know you're out there. I know you're listening. So if that's one of you, thank you. I am really glad you're here. So if you do want to have a discussion with me, if you want to argue with me, that is perfectly okay. I do encourage that. So feel free to leave your comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts if you do disagree. So don't be afraid to say something if you have a disagreement with me. I love hearing those things, as well as things that maybe you agree with, or maybe you have some more insights. Maybe something I missed. Leave your comments. I love to hear from all of you. Thank you so much for everyone who's been commenting. This article is going to have a lot of theological depth. It's about the great crowd. The title of the article is "Look, a Great Crowd." And I'm going to have to read every single thing in this whole article. When I was going through it, I was highlighting things, and then I realized I was basically highlighting the whole article because practically every paragraph had something that I needed to discuss within it. So we're just going to read the whole thing, and so I apologize if this podcast or video is longer than normal. We just have a lot to get into because this is directly related to the two hopes, the two classes theology, however you want to call that. It's one of the most important doctrines to the Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, if this doctrine were to fall through, a lot of other Watchtower doctrines would also just completely collapse. So this perspective is very, very foundational to the Jehovah's Witnesses. So the key text here is Revelation chapter 7, verse 9, and that says, "After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and people and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands." So this whole chapter of Revelation 7 is where they get the idea of the great crowd from primarily. Now there's other texts they go to, but if you want to talk about the great crowd, this is where the great crowd is explicitly described in great detail. So a very, very important chapter to the Jehovah's Witnesses, and likewise you're also going to find the 144,000 described in this chapter. So let's find out, is this whole two hopes theology, can it be found within the text? In other words, does the Bible describe a group of Christians who have a heavenly hope? In other words, they're going to go to heaven and rule with Christ and be there for all eternity? And is there going to be a separate group of Christians who are going to be resurrected and live forever on a restored paradise earth? So are you going to have these distinct groups eternally separated by location? Do you see that described in the scriptures? Well, Jehovah's Witness is going to go to Revelation chapter 7 and probably Revelation 14 and say, yes, here is where those two groups are described. And so let's find out. Does Revelation chapter 7 distinguish these two groups in that particular way? Paragraph 1. At the end of the 1st century CE, the Apostle John was in a distressing situation. He was elderly, confined to the Isle of Patmos, and likely the only apostle alive. He knew that opposers were misleading congregations and causing divisions. It may have seemed that the small flame of Christianity was about to be extinguished. Well, according to the Watchtower and just Jehovah's Witnesses in general, they do believe that Christianity was all but extinguished after the apostles died out. They believe that there was an apostasy early on, to where there were just few to maybe none true Christians alive. And if you don't think that's the case, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, then point me to maybe an early church father who you think was basically a Jehovah's Witness. Now, I'm not expecting you to find me someone early who believed that everything that you believe, but let's say the core doctrines of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Because what I will tell you is that the earliest Christians believe things that you as a Jehovah's Witness would find to be a completely apostate false idea that would get you disfellowshipped if you believed it today. For example, you can find the earliest Christians having no problem with calling Jesus God. And by early Christians, I mean the early church fathers who lived immediately following the death of the apostles. They had no problem calling Jesus God and describing him in deity and describing him in ways that no Jehovah's Witness would describe him today. Now, I'm not saying at the outset that they're right or they're wrong. I'm just saying that's what these church fathers believed very, very early on. So I don't know. Can you point me to an early Christian who we have the writings of, who you would consider a Jehovah's Witness today? So my whole point here is that according to the Watchtower, Christianity was basically extinguished, or whatever true Christianity was, and immediately you had apostasy. So I thought this sentence was pretty interesting. Paragraph 2. Amid these dire circumstances, John received an exciting prophetic vision. In it, angels are told to hold back the destructive winds of the Great Tribulation until the final sealing of a group of slaves. And they have here Revelation chapter 7, 1 through 3. And let's go ahead and look at that. Revelation 7, 1 through 3. And I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, so that no wind would blow on the earth, or on the sea, or on any tree. And I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God, and he cried out with a loud voice to the 4 angels, to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the bondservants of our God on their foreheads. Okay, so there we have the 144,000 essentially described. And that's what they say here next. They say, the Watchtower says, that group is made up of 144,000 who will rule in Jesus in heaven. Now, did we see anything yet in Revelation chapter 7 that describes the location of this group of 144,000? Well, maybe we haven't found it yet, so maybe we need to read on to find it. Verse 4, and I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. And then you have those 12 tribes described here going all the way up through verse 9. Nothing said here about location. Well, maybe we need to look at these texts of the Watchtower quotes here, because they say here that group is made up of 144,000 who will rule with Jesus in heaven. So it must be that Luke 12:32 describes the location of this group. So let's go check out Luke 12:32. And I guarantee you, Jehovah's Witnesses who see these verses quoted here, they just assume they are supporting what the Watchtower is saying. Because when you ask a Jehovah's Witness, like, hey, do you think these articles that the Watchtower is writing, do you think they're biblical? They're going to be like, well, yeah, they're just citing scripture here. But when you actually go to those scriptures, they just don't describe what they're saying they mean. Luke 12:32. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has chosen gladly to give you the kingdom. Do you see anything there talking about the location of the group that Jesus is describing here? Well, no, you don't. But they're described as a little flock. Okay, so they must be a part of the 144,000. So you have a smaller group of 144,000. Jesus describes them as a little flock. There we go. It's all connected. Well, look at the context of Luke chapter 12. Why does Jesus call them a little flock? Well, the answer is found in the very context. Go to the very beginning of the chapter. Because in the beginning of the chapter, what you have described here is a large group. It says in verse 1, under these circumstances, after so many thousands of people had gathered together that they were stepping on one another, he began saying to his disciples, first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Okay, so what you have here is a large group of many thousands, and then you have the group of the disciples here. So you can keep on reading through the context, and you're going to see a contrast between the large group that Jesus has before him and the disciples. A very small group of people, obviously. But Jesus isn't describing them as a little flock in relation to the rest of Christians. He's calling them a little flock in relation to his audience who is standing before him. The Jehovah's Witnesses are simply reading into this text more than what is actually there. So he's not calling them a little flock because they're 144,000. He's not trying to make this connection there. Oh, but what about the kingdom? He's giving them the kingdom. That must mean heaven, right? He's giving them the kingdom. Heaven is the kingdom, and the 144,000 are those heavenly ones. And so there's all the connections. Well, what about giving the kingdom? Is a Jehovah's Witness trying to tell us that only the 144,000 are given the kingdom? Well, that can't be true. Go to Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 32. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Here's the key. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. So there we have all of the sheep. And under JW theology, those sheep are the great crowd. So if that's the case, Jesus is saying to the great crowd, you're going to inherit the kingdom. Well, wait a second. I thought only the little flock is given the kingdom. Well, sounds like here in Matthew 25, according to the Watchtower's own theology, that the great crowd is given the kingdom. So what's going on there? Well, I think what's going on there is that all true Christians are given the kingdom, or they inherit the kingdom. right? Oh, well, maybe there's a difference there, and maybe you inherit something, but you're not actually going to be in the kingdom. Well, that actually doesn't work either. Look at Matthew chapter 8, verse 11. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the ones who the Jehovah's Witnesses think are going to be on the paradise earth, they're going to be in the kingdom of heaven. So back to Luke 12:32 and this paragraph number 2 from this Watchtower, there's just nothing here talking about a location of the 144,000. It's just simply not there, but the Jehovah's Witnesses just assume it's there. Then John mentions another group so vast that he exclaims, "Look," an expression that may vindicate his surprise at seeing something unexpected. What does John see? A great crowd which no man was able to number, out of all the nations and tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And they say here to read Revelation 7, 9 through 14. So let's go ahead and do that. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands. And they cry out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the 4 living creatures, and they fell on their faces before the throne and worshipped God, saying, Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen. Then one of the elders answered, saying to me, These who are clothed in the white robes, who are they, and where have they come from? I said to them, My Lord, you know. And he said to me, These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So what the Watchtower is saying here is that, look, you've got a different group described here, and this is those with an earthly hope, and the ones described previously, the 144,000, those are the ones with the heavenly hope. But I ask again, do you see any locational distinguishment between these two groups described? The only thing you can find as far as anything related to a location is that this great crowd is found standing before the throne. That's the only thing where you can find something to correlate a location with. So if anything, it almost sounds like the great crowd is the one who's more described with more of a heavenly hope than the 144,000. There's just nothing with the 144,000 that just describes them in relation to a location, but the great crowd is. So where do we find this locational distinguishment? Well, I would say I'll leave that to you. If you want to look at this whole standing before the throne language as referring to heaven or earth, that's fine. You can have that. We can have that discussion separately. That's not integral to my point here. What I want to ask is, who is the 144,000 in relation to the great crowd? Now, what I'm going to describe here is fairly controversial. It really depends on your view of eschatology, because those of you who might have a little more of a dispensationalist leaning, you're going to think this 144,000 is a group of literal physical descendants of Jews, like real Jews, and the great crowd is going to be a separate group. So you are separating those two groups, although you may not be separating them into two locations, but you may be separating them as far as maybe the plan of God in relation to those groups. So I'm going to do my best to not get too controversial here and too caught up in those details, but I want to kind of share with you my view and how I read this passage, and I'm completely open to being corrected here. So my view in a nutshell is that the 144,000 is talking about what John heard. Okay? The 144,000 is described to John. Notice, John doesn't actually see the 144,000. He is told about the 144,000. Read the account for yourself. Now, what John saw is he saw the four angels standing at the four corners of the earth, holding back the four winds. John is seeing here an earthly vision. Okay, he's seeing these angels on the earth. So you have like an earthly setting already, which is really, really interesting, because he's about to go on to describe, or he's about to be told about the 144,000. I mean, notice that. Look at this. And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. That's clear. John is told about this group. But when you get to verse 9, it says, he looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could count. So starting in verse 9, John is describing something that he sees. So again, the verses prior to that, he's being told things. So he sees this earthly vision. He is told about a group. He hears about this group. And then he has a vision, and he is seeing a group. So my perspective on this is that the 144,000 is actually the same group that John sees. So you have one group being described in two different ways. The 144,000 is being told to John, and they have these particular characteristics that he's told about, but then he sees a group. So what I want to say here is that there is nothing about this group of 144,000 that can't also be said about this great crowd. There's no unique attributes, I don't think. Now, they're described here as being from the 12 tribes of Israel. That is true. But also, look at verse 9. They're from every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues. So why wouldn't the great crowd also consist of members from the 12 tribes of Israel if you think that's just literal Jews, okay? So let me give you like an interesting parallel I like to go to. This whole thing about being told something versus what you are actually seeing. And I think there's a really interesting way of viewing this in Revelation chapter 5. If you go to verse 5 in Revelation chapter 5, it says, one of the elders said to me, stop weeping. Behold, the lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has overcome so as to open the book and its 7 seals. So John is told something. He's told about a lion. But look at what John sees. And I saw between the throne with the 4 living creatures and the elders a lamb standing as if slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. So look at this carefully. John is told about a lion, but what he sees is a lamb. So you can maybe call that a contradiction if you want to be hypercritical, but why not try to just reconcile these things and say that what John is described and heard and what he sees are two different things, but you can harmonize those two things together and say that Jesus is both a lion and he is a lamb. He has both of those characteristics. So why can't you go to Revelation chapter 7 and say that you can have two different versions of the same group and harmonize those two together? I just don't see any reason why you can't see this group as all of the same thing being described in two different ways. And I want to give you another clue. If you go to Revelation chapter 9, you find something really interesting in verse 4. They were told not to hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only the men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. In other words, if you don't have this seal of God on your forehead, you're in big trouble. Go back to Revelation chapter 7 and look at verse 3. Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the bondservants of our God on their foreheads. So according to this, only the 144,000 have this seal of God on your foreheads. But if you go to Revelation 9:4, if you don't have this seal, you're in big trouble. Well, if you go to Revelation 7:9, you don't have anywhere where the great crowd is described as having this seal. Okay, but I don't think you would believe that the great crowd is in big trouble because it looks like they've got a pretty good situation. So this, when you separate these two groups like this, like the Jehovah's Witnesses do, I think you run into some big problems. And so I think the most consistent way to harmonize this and put all these pieces together is that to say the 144,000 and the great crowd are basically members of the same group, and that's just the group of true Christians. They all have the seal of God. So I don't see the reason to separate them into two locations. So I know that was a pretty long explanation of all of this, but I wanted to make sure you understood how I view these things, because I don't think we have a very persuasive case made by the Watchtower just yet, and we're only in paragraph 2, so let's see what else they say. Paragraph 3. That vision no doubt strengthened John's faith. How much more should it strengthen our faith since we live in the time of the fulfillment of the vision? We have seen the gathering of millions whose hope is to survive the great tribulation and live forever on earth. In this article, we will learn how Jehovah revealed the identity of that great crowd to his people more than 8 decades ago. Then we will consider 2 features of that crowd, its size and its diversity. These points would strengthen the faith of all who hope to be part of that blessed group. Now, what's really interesting about this is that they're saying that we live in the time of the fulfillment of the vision. Really? Because in this vision, this is talking about those who come out of the Great Tribulation. Well, as far as I know from Watchtower theology, the Great Tribulation hasn't even started yet. So how can you say that this vision is being fulfilled? How else can you read this? They come out of the Great Tribulation, then they're described as a great crowd. How is that being fulfilled today? Even within Jehovah's Witness theology, that's got to be just a completely false statement. You're not living in the time of the fulfillment of that vision. Now, you can say that you have members of the great crowd living right now, but how does that even make sense? They're not described as a great crowd until after the Great Tribulation. Paragraph 4. Christendom generally does not teach the scriptural truth that one day obedient humans will live forever on earth. Now, I think that might be true, that if you just went and interviewed a number of Christians and you asked them, where do you think you're going to spend eternity? They're probably going to say, well, I'm going to go to heaven. That's what I would say most Christians do believe. But I would say Christians that are very informed on this, that really know their theology, they've really thought their theology through, I think you'll find a lot of those Christians would describe that, we're going to have a new earth, a new heavens and a new earth. And we're going to live forever on a restored earth. And they would even say something like heaven and earth are going to be kind of combined. And so you're going to have a heaven on earth sort of thing where Christ and Jehovah are going to be on earth. We're going to dwell with God. I think that's what a lot of more informed Christians are going to say. And if you think I'm like off on that, if you think that's more of a fringe group, you can find plenty of very prominent scholars who hold that view that Christians are going to live forever on a new earth. I mean, just to give you one name, no little name, N.T. Wright. You may have heard of him. N.T. Wright is one of the most prominent theologians alive today, extremely prominent. And you can read his books where he goes into great detail in describing that the locational hope for Christians is on a restored earth. So the Watchtower is somewhat right here. That generally Christendom doesn't hold to this. But then they say today most religions in Christendom teach that all good people go to heaven when they die. Now, I don't think that's true. I think most Christians would say that that you have to have Jesus Christ, and that it's not your good works or your goodness that would send you to heaven. It's the righteousness of Christ and believing in Him that allows you to go to heaven. It's really the more liberal groups that teach that just good people go to heaven when they die. But I don't think that still encompasses the majority of Christendom. If the Watchtower is right on that, show me the numbers. Is there a poll that teaches that, or are they just saying this? It was different, however, when the small group of Bible students were publishing the Watchtower in the late 1800s. They understood God would restore paradise on earth and that millions of obedient humans would live here on earth, not in heaven. However, it took time for them to discern clearly who these obedient humans would be. Now, this is a really interesting admission because I've heard more of the Jehovah's Witness apologists, the ones who like to go on the internet and defend their beliefs. Those apologists would say that there are certain things that you don't necessarily need the Watchtower to teach you. They're so clear from reading the Scripture. For example, Jehovah's name, or that the Trinity is false. Things like that. Another thing is the new earth or paradise earth. That's just one of the core doctrines that you can just read the Bible without the Watchtower and say, yeah, you don't need the Watchtower to find this in the Bible. This is just so strikingly clear. So why couldn't it be, if that was so clear, just as clear as their view on annihilationism, for example? If that's so clear, why couldn't the early Jehovah's Witnesses hold to that, right? If that's so clear. Paragraph 5, of course, the Bible students also discerned from the Scriptures that some would be bought from the earth to rule with Jesus in heaven. So here's another place where they think this is teaching that the 144,000 is in a locationally different place from the great crowd. Well, if you go to Revelation chapter 5, verse 9, it says, "And they sang a new song, saying, 'Worthy are you to take the book and break its seals, for you were slain, and you purchased for God with your blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. And you have made them to be a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth.'" So how do you harmonize these two things? Well, it sounds like here, if you have the 144,000 being described, they're reigning upon the earth. Well, if you go to Revelation chapter 14, verse 3, it says they were purchased from the earth. And I think the Watchtower is reading too much into this verse about being purchased from the earth. Now, let me give you like a parallel just in language. Last weekend, I purchased Chick-fil-A. Like, I got fries and I got some grilled nuggets. I purchased those from Chick-fil-A. But I never left Chick-fil-A when I had my meal. So you can purchase something from a location, but those things don't necessarily have to leave that location. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I think it's purchased from the earth is just describing the location from which they were purchased from. I mean, where else would they be besides the earth? right? It wouldn't make sense to say they were purchased from heaven. They were purchased from the earth because that's just where these people were that got purchased. But is Revelation 14, there are other places where it describes them as being in heaven. Well, look at this. I think this is not describing a group that's in heaven. 14:1, Then I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads. Sounds to me like you've got an earthly setting here. You have Mount Zion, and so I don't see anything here talking about heaven yet. But look at verse 2. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the sound of many waters and like the sound of thunder, and a voice which I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps, and they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders, and no one could learn the song except 144,000 who had been purchased from the earth. So what's interesting here is that John sees something, but then he hears something from heaven, implying that the vision is on earth, because he's hearing something from another place. And so I think there's some clues here which make this look like this is an earthly scene, not a heavenly scene. He's seeing something on earth, he's hearing something on heaven. So I still don't see anything explicitly describing this group of 144,000 as having an eternally separate locational hope from the rest of Christians. There's nothing yet. Let's continue on. We're never going to get through. This is in paragraph 5. We've got a long ways to go. That group would be made up of 144,000 zealous and dedicated Christians who had served God faithfully while on earth. What about the great crowd? In his vision, John saw that group standing before the throne and before the Lamb. Those words led the Bible students to conclude, like the 144,000, the great crowd would reside in heaven. Now, why come to that conclusion? We've not seen anything yet that would just explicitly state that this group is a separate group. If both the 144,000 and the great crowd were to live in heaven, how would one group differ from the other? Well, that's a great question. The Bible students thought that the great crowd must be made up of Christians who had not been fully obedient to God while here on earth. Why would you conclude that? Although leading reasonably clean lives, some of them may have remained in Christendom's churches. The Bible students concluded that such ones demonstrated a measure of zeal, but not enough to rule with Jesus. Because of their love for God had not been sufficiently fervent, the great crowd would qualify to be in heaven before the throne, but not to sit on thrones. Wow, you've got some really, really poor reasoning by the early Bible students. Paragraph 7. Who then would live on earth? The Bible students believe that after the 144,000 and the great crowd were gathered to heaven, millions of others would be granted life on earth to experience the blessings of Christ's millennial reign. The Bible students did not expect those millions to serve Jehovah before the start of Christ's reign. Rather, it was thought that this group would be educated in Jehovah's ways during the millennium. Thereafter, those who conform to Jehovah's standards would be blessed with everlasting life on earth, whereas those who rebelled would be destroyed. The Bible students also thought that perhaps some who would serve as earthly princes during that time, including the resurrected ancient worthies, faithful men who died before Christ, would somehow be rewarded with heavenly life at the end of the millennium. Thus, the Bible students felt that there were three groups: the 144,000 who would rule with Jesus in heaven, and 2, the great crowd of less zealous Christians who would stand before the throne of Jesus in heaven, and 3, millions of people who would be educated in Jehovah's ways on earth during the 1,000-year reign. In Jehovah's due time, however, the light of the truth began to shine ever brighter on this topic. So in other words, you can give them a free pass. It's okay that these early Bible students were wrong and misinformed. They were just trying to figure things out. Give them a break, give them a free pass. It's okay. The light would get brighter and brighter and brighter. Well, why can't the rest of us get a free pass? Why is it just them? Because the rest of us are going to get destroyed at Armageddon. Why don't we get a free pass? Why is it okay for them to get a free pass? That's one thing. The second thing is that this isn't actually that drastically different from what Jehovah's Witnesses believe today. Kind of in conclusion, when you go to paragraph 8, they talk about 3 groups. Okay, so I'm not saying there aren't differences. Indeed, there are differences, but let's kind of look at the big picture here. Because within Jehovah's Witnesses theology, there really are 3 groups. Okay, when you think about what's going to happen in the end, there are 3 groups. You have faithful Jehovah's Witnesses who are part of the great crowd. They're going to be resurrected to live on earth during the millennium. That's one group. The second group is that you have the resurrection of the unrighteous. They're also going to live on the earth, and they're going to have the opportunity to learn about Jehovah. I guess they're going to be taught by Jehovah's Witnesses, and they're going to have the opportunity to learn about Jehovah and repent and be a follower of Jehovah. That's the second group. The third group, of course, is going to be the 144,000 who will be resurrected and live in heaven with Christ, during that 1,000 years, and they will continue to be with Christ. And so there you have 3 hopes, three different groups. Okay, three resurrections, in other words. So not a whole lot different from what is described here in paragraph 8. And of course, here they say at the end, the light gets brighter and brighter. Go look at Proverbs chapter 4. I'm not going to get into that. Many of you already know how poor that reasoning is, because Proverbs 4 is not talking about doctrinal truth getting brighter and brighter or anything like that. It's talking about the righteousness, right? Being sanctified, conformed to the image of Jehovah, becoming more like Jehovah. It's talking about sanctification, not talking about doctrinal truth getting more clarified as time goes on. Paragraph 9. In 1935, the identity of the great crowd in John's vision was clarified. Jehovah's Witnesses came to realize that the great crowd do not literally have to be in heaven to stand before the throne and before the Lamb. Rather, their position is figurative. Well, now, isn't that convenient? They just get to say it's figurative. Why not give a better explanation than that? Well, Jehovah's Witnesses are just going to buy that explanation, right? Oh, it's just figurative. Let's not give any reasons for why we believe that. Let's just say it's figurative. Apparently that passes for truth, but I don't think you should buy it. I think you need to ask for better reasons for why you think that language of before the throne and before the Lamb is figurative. Even though they would live on earth, the great crowd could stand before the throne by recognizing Jehovah's authority and by submitting to his sovereignty. They could stand before the Lamb by exercising faith in Jesus' ransom sacrifice. That reasoning just doesn't make sense. You need to provide better reason, because saying that, because I exercise faith, then figuratively I'm standing before the throne. Well, that explanation just, I don't think works. That's not very good reasoning. Find a better reason for believing that. Similarly, in Matthew 25:31 and 32, all the nations, including the wicked, are said to be gathered before Jesus on his glorious throne. Now, if that's all the nations, if that's everyone, then why can't that include the 144,000, right? Everyone is gathered before the Lamb. All Christians. And that you either inherit the kingdom or you don't. So the 144,000 have to be included in that. Clearly, all these nations are not in heaven, but on earth. There's the admission. All the nations are on earth. Must include the 144,000. There's no way out of that. And if you think that the brothers described in Matthew 25 are the 144,000, again, that's very, very poor reasoning. And I'm not going to get into all that. If you want to defend that notion, let's talk about that. I think that's just a really, really poor argument to think that the brothers described in Matthew 25 are the 144,000, and that's how they get out of that one, but I don't think that works. This adjusted understanding makes sense. It explains why the Bible does not say that the great crowd is raised to heaven. But there's nothing in the text that talks about being raised to heaven. They're gathered before the throne and they inherit the kingdom. Only one group is promised everlasting life in heaven, the 144,000 who will rule as kings over the earth with Jesus. So they're quoting here Revelation chapter 5, verse 10. And I think they need to prove that this over, as opposed to upon, is the best translation. Because most Bibles don't have any problem with translating it as ruling upon the earth. But the New World Translation wants to use over the earth. So please, show me an argument for that. Why the word over is better than ruling upon. But even if ruling over the earth is the best translation, that doesn't mean that must mean that you're not on earth. Right? Because you can say the President of the United States rules over the United States. But that doesn't mean he's not located in the United States. So you can be located in that very place by which you're ruling over. The King of England, ruled over the King of England. This language doesn't just explicitly mean that you're separate from the location that you rule over. It's just not very good reasoning. Paragraph 10. Since 1935, Jehovah's Witnesses have thus understood that the great crowd of John's vision is made up of a group of faithful Christians who have the prospect of living forever on earth. In order to survive the Great Tribulation, the great crowd would have to be educated in Jehovah's ways before the millennium begins. They would need to show strong faith in order to succeed in escaping all these things that must occur before Christ's 1,000-year reign. So this is really, in essence, a salvation of works. You have to show strong faith and you have to succeed. Why not talk about the righteousness of Christ? Because I would say that in order to survive the Great Tribulation, you have to have faith in Christ. And it's not going to be by your righteousness that you make it through. It's going to be by your faith, apart from your works. So I would say paragraph 10 really describes the Jehovah's Witnesses' works salvation system. Paragraph 11. What about the view that some exemplary ones on earth will be raised to heaven after the millennium? That possibility was suggested years ago in the February 15th, 1913 issue of the Watchtower. One could have reasoned, why would the faithful men of old receive a mere earthly inheritance, but Christians were somewhat negligent be rewarded with life in heaven? Of course, that thinking was influenced by two incorrect assumptions. One, that the great crowd would reside in heaven, and two, that the great crowd would be made up of less zealous Christians. As we have seen, however, since 1935, Jehovah's Witnesses have clearly understood that the survivors of Armageddon are the great crowd of John's vision. They will come out of the Great Tribulation right here on earth, and they will keep shouting with a loud voice, saying, "Salvation we owe to our God, who is seated on the throne, and to the Lamb." Furthermore, the Scriptures teach that those who are resurrected to heavenly life receive something better than do the faithful men of old. And they quote here Hebrews 11:40. So let's go to Hebrews 11:40 and see if there's anything there about the location. Let's go to verse 39. And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. Is there anything there about receiving like a locationally different hope? Is that what the something better for us is? Well, I don't think so. Look at the context here, because what we have here in the context is a heavenly city. Okay, so look in verse 16. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So what is that talking about? So that's talking about what the prophets of old, the old covenant prophets like Abraham, is talking about what they're going to get. Now, they didn't get the promised land, and that's what this is talking about here. The promised land that Abraham, of course, never really received. He was told about it. He was told about his offspring, his seed, just being greater than the sands of the seashore and things like that. So they didn't get what was promised to them, but they would get it eventually. In fact, if you go to Romans chapter 4, verse 13, you see something very interesting. Romans 4:13, which is talking about that for the promise to Abraham or to his descendants, that he would be heir of the world. So this whole promised land thing, it wasn't just a specific spot of land. This promise was to expand through the whole earth. That's what it was really all about. So Abraham would be heir of the world. That is really the heavenly city. It's just this whole worldly thing. And so this whole something better, it's something better than the promised land, right? There was something better. Hebrews 11:40 is not talking about the something better as referring to heaven as a separate location from what the great crowd is going to be given. The Watchtower reads way too much into these texts, and they just fail to look at the context to prove their positions. Our brothers accordingly began enthusiastically inviting people to serve Jehovah with the hope of living forever on earth. Those of the great crowd rejoice in their hope. They understand that Jehovah determines where his faithful worshipers will serve him, whether in heaven or on earth. Both the anointed and the great crowd recognize that their reward is possible only because of Jehovah's undeserved kindness as expressed through the ransom sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Look at this a little more carefully. They're saying it's only possible because of Jehovah's undeserved kindness, and I appreciate that. But they also said there previously that during the millennium, you've got to prove your faithfulness. It's all about learning about Jehovah and proving your service to him. It's very much a works-based salvation, so it's not solely because of Jehovah's undeserved kindness. It's a grace plus works salvation system. Because what a true Christian is going to say is that God letting me into the kingdom has nothing to do with my faithfulness, because I'm not faithful. I'm a sinner and I need grace. Grace is my only hope. Christ's righteousness imputed to me is my only hope, because I'm a failure. If it's going to be based on my performance, I am not going to make it. It's only because of Jehovah's undeserved kindness through the sacrifice of Christ that I'm going to inherit the kingdom. Paragraph 14. After the understanding of Jehovah's people was clarified in 1935, many still wondered just how those with an earthly hope could become a great crowd in size. For example, Ronald Parkin was 12 years old when the identity of the great crowd was made clear. At that time, he recalls, There were about 56,000 publishers worldwide, and many, perhaps most of them, were anointed. So the great crowd did not seem very great. In the following decades, however, missionaries were sent to many lands, and the number of Jehovah's Witnesses steadily increased. Then in 1968, a Bible study program was started using the book The Truth That Leads to Eternal Life. Its simple explanation of Bible truth attracted meek people as never before. So we see there that the truth that leads to eternal life contain simple Bible truth. That was in 1968. How many Jehovah's Witnesses would say that that book is Bible truth? How many Jehovah's Witnesses today are still reading that publication? Because I guarantee if you looked at that publication, there's going to be a lot of things that Jehovah's Witnesses would now consider to be false. So why would they say that that is a simple explanation of Bible truth when it has false information in it? Would you also say that the book, The Finished Mystery, contains simple Bible truth? No. In fact, there is probably very little in the Finished Mystery that a Jehovah's Witness would agree with today. So I found it interesting that they're putting here about these publications starting in 1943, going all the way up to the books today. It says, which publication did you study when learning the truth? When in fact, these books, these older books, do not have the truth. They have false information. Now, they may say it has some truth in it, but you're not going to call these publications the truth when you don't actually believe them. So why say things like that? Well, it's because you want to say that the Jehovah's Witnesses are the truth. And so you can't have your cake and eat it too. Stop calling these things the truth. Continuing on, within 4 years, more than 500,000 new disciples got baptized. As the Catholic Church began to lose its grip on Latin America and other countries, and as restrictions on our work were lifted in Eastern Europe and parts of Africa, millions more got baptized. In more recent years, Jehovah's organization has produced a number of other effective tools to help people learn what the Bible teaches. There is no doubt that a great crowd, now numbering more than 8 million, has been gathered. Paragraph 16. In recording his vision, John noted that the great crowd would come from all nations and tribes and peoples and tongues. The prophet Zechariah had earlier foretold something similar. He wrote, "In those days 10 men out of all the languages and nations would take hold, yes, and they will take firm hold of the robe of a Jew, saying, 'We want to go with you, for we have heard that God is with you people.'" Now, why would you say that specifically about the great crowd and can't also be applied to the 144,000? Well, they don't say. Jehovah's Witnesses are just going to assume that is true. You really have to question these things. Don't just assume that when the Watchtower quotes something that it applies to their reasoning. Paragraph 17. Jehovah's Witnesses realize that for people of all nations to be gathered, the good news must be preached in many languages. We have been translating the Bible study material for over 130 years, but now we are carrying out the greatest translation effort in history in hundreds of languages. Clearly, Jehovah is performing a modern-day miracle, gathering a great crowd from all nations. Is it really true that they are carrying out the greatest translation effort in history? I would like to know if that's really true. If they really are carrying out the greatest translation effort in history, because I would be willing to bet that if you looked at all of what's called Christendom's translations efforts, whether it's the Bible or other things, that their efforts or have much more wide of a spectrum in terms of translation efforts than the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, it might be that the translation effort on non-Bibles is greater, but I think what's more important is how many translations of the Bible are you making as a Jehovah's Witness versus how many Bibles in other translations are Christendom making. Compare those two. I think that's what really matters, not how many translations you make of what you're calling Bible study aids. Thanks to the availability of spiritual food in more and more languages, this diverse group is united in worship, and the witnesses are well known for their zealous preaching and their brotherly love. How faith-strengthening that is. Now, think about this. Think about all of this translation effort of Bible study material, and think about how obsolete that material is going to be in 5, 10, 20 years, because they're going to have new understandings of all this stuff. This generation, I can guarantee you, is going to be changed again. It's just a matter of time. And so basically what they're producing in so many languages is disposable Bible truths. That's just what it is. So what's more important? Translating the Bible, which is not disposable, or translating Bible study aids that are disposable? What's more important? I think making the one that's not disposable, that's not going to change, that is God's inspired word, is far more important than translating Bible study material. So why focus more on one than the other? Paragraph 18. We have every reason to be excited about the prophecy of a great crowd. We are not surprised that Jehovah has fulfilled that prophecy in such a marvelous way. Those of the great crowd are grateful for the hope Jehovah has given them. They do not feel left out because they are not anointed by God's Spirit to serve with Jesus in heaven. Well, speak for yourself. Because the salvation of the great crowd depends on how they treat the anointed class. You can find that explicitly stated if you search for that in the Watchtower library. The anointed class obviously have a very privileged position in that sense. They get to partake. So how can you not feel left out when the bread and the wine get passed around? How can you not feel left out? Because by not partaking, you are disobeying the command of Jesus to do this in remembrance of me. I think you should feel left out if you're not one of the anointed, because you're missing out on a huge blessing, and that is partaking of the communion, of the Lord's table. I've done so many discussions on the Lord's table, so go there and check those out. But I think that's just one of many reasons why you should feel left out. So I would say in answer to this, speak for yourself, Watchtower, because you're telling people not to feel left out. But then you go say all these other things about the anointed that is quite a privilege that I would feel very envious and covetous of. Continuing on, we're almost done here. Throughout the scriptures, we read of men and women of faith who were deeply influenced by Holy Spirit, yet they are not part of the 144,000. John the Baptist is one example. Matthew 11:11. Now, I have an entire article on my website, michaeljfelker.com, that talks about Matthew 11:11. I'll just read it for you real quick. Truly, truly, I say to you, among those born of a woman, there has not arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And in a nutshell, the explanation of this is not saying that John the Baptist won't be in the kingdom of heaven, because if you go to Matthew 8:11, it talks about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being in the kingdom of heaven. And of course, John the Baptist is part of that group. So you've got to be able to harmonize these two things. And so the explanation is that this is contrasting this age with the age to come. So yes, in the age to come, The least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John the Baptist as he is in that present time. Yes, that's where the contrast is. It's not saying that John the Baptist won't be in the kingdom of heaven. It's talking about the age now versus the age to come. Then it says here, David is another. They and countless others will be resurrected to life on a paradise earth. All of them, along with the great crowd, will have the opportunity to demonstrate their loyalty to Jehovah and his sovereignty. So there we have again the emphasis on the works righteousness. They have to demonstrate their loyalty. That is works salvation. If it's not works salvation, I don't know what it is. Because I would say as a Christian, your salvation is not dependent on your loyalty to Jehovah. Why? Because you're going to fail. You're going to fail to be loyal to Jehovah. It's about Christ's loyalty to Jehovah. That is your basis for salvation, not your loyalty to Jehovah. Last paragraph. Never before in human history has God united millions of people from all nations. Whether our hope is to live in heaven or on earth, we need to help as many as possible to become part of the great crowd of the other sheep. Now, that's because they believe that you're going to be destroyed in Armageddon, right? If you're not believing these kind of things, if Armageddon comes and you're around, you're going to be destroyed. But this is about being at the wrong place at the wrong time, because if you died and you never heard about these things, right? Well, then you're probably going to be resurrected. You're going to be one of the unrighteous that's resurrected, and you'll have the opportunity to learn about Jehovah during the 1,000 years. So the reason why Jehovah's Witnesses are going door to door is because it could just be that Armageddon is going to come soon, and so they don't want you to be destroyed at Armageddon. So, you don't want to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. However, if they're going to your door, it could just be that if you died tomorrow, you're probably going to get resurrected because you didn't die during the Great Tribulation. Soon Jehovah will bring the foretold Great Tribulation that will destroy the governments and religions that have afflicted mankind. So basically, if you're not one of Jehovah's Witnesses, you're going to be destroyed during the Great Tribulation. What an outstanding privilege lies before all members of the great crowd to serve Jehovah on earth forever. So we finally conclude with this article. I know that was a lot longer than normal, but I hope by reading all of this you could see the Watchtower does not give good reasons for their two hopes theology. Maybe a Jehovah's Witness will think that they described it elsewhere in more detail, but I challenge you to go find it elsewhere. Go see elsewhere if they can really prove that there are two different locational hopes for all Christians. I don't think you're going to find it. If you think you can find it, let me know. I would be glad to discuss it with you. So I really appreciate you sticking through this whole explanation, and share your thoughts, share your comments. Don't forget to like these videos. When you like these videos, that really does help get the word out. If you listen to this on podcasts, on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, or whatever it's called now, please leave your ratings, leave your reviews. I really do appreciate all of your support. Please subscribe to the channel so that you can be notified when these new videos come out, or you can go to michaeljfelker.com. And you can also subscribe there to where you'll be notified whether it's an article I post or a video that's posted. You'll be notified for all of it. So with that said, thank you so much for watching or listening to this. And for those of you who celebrate Thanksgiving, have a great Thanksgiving this week. Regardless, if you don't celebrate Thanksgiving, you're probably going to be spending time with your families this week. So I hope you all enjoy that time, and I will see you next week. For more information about Jehovah's Witnesses and other topics, please visit michaeljfelker.com. There you can also reach me directly to submit questions or comments to be covered on the JW Review. To subscribe to this podcast, please go to iTunes and search for the JW Review.